Hello and welcome to this month's Practice as Research seminar. I'm really excited to have with me two interesting speakers, and the topic is even more exciting, I think. So the topic today is sonic postcards as an arts-based approach to encourage collaboration. And we have with us Dr. Lisa Griffin and Professor George Revill. Lisa is an associate professor of urban health and environmental politics at UCL in the Bartlett. And Lisa's research on urban health and spatial politics includes projects on community responses to urban flooding, relationships between green spaces and well-being, and placemaking for people with dementia. Her work on the creative practice and the Anthropocene explores how publicly engaged art-based thinking and practice can intervene productively in the current environmental crisis. And I've come across Lisa's work through our joint membership in the Creative Research Methods community. And this is why I've reached out, because I found that it's an interesting space to work, like from the Bartlett, coming from the Bartlett, which is sort of within the social sciences to some extent, but actually also outside of the social sciences, sitting in humanities and the arts as well. And that's something that I was particularly interested in terms of the interdisciplinarity that we can foster here. George is Professor of Cultural Historical Geography at the Open University, and his work is concerned with the landscape as a way of understanding past and contemporary experience and understanding of place, environment, and nature. Research projects involving creative practice include the AHRC-funded Earth in Vision, focusing on digital broadcast archives and environmental history, and Sounding Coastal Change and Sounding Out Wales, which used sound and music to explore environmental and social changes on the North Norfolk coast. And when I heard and read about that part of the work, George, I must say I was particularly delighted, as I am quite on a personal level. I'm planning a long distance walk along the Peddars Way, so I thought, oh, this is a nice one as well. So it's always nice to be able to kind of make these connections with people. As always,
go to Wells Maltings.
I definitely will. So we are going to have, as usual, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and I'm handing over to George and Lisa for the presentation part. As always, feel free to use the chat function. I will keep an eye on it. And obviously, as soon as the presentation finishes, you can shoot with questions. And if you don't want to sort of ask the questions directly yourself, I'm quite happy to ask them on your behalf. But it'd be nice to have a conversation rather than a lecture, if we like. So with no further ado, handing over to the two of you.
Great, thank you so much, Nicole, and thanks for this warm invitation. Your seminar series looks super fantastic, so it's really nice to be part of it. So as Nicole says, we're going to talk about sonic postcards and environmental engagement using creative practice. And in particular, we want to examine how arts-based policy approaches can be used to foster engagement between policymakers and coastal stakeholders. And this particular engagement is about UK fisheries, which many years ago was the topic of my PhD thesis. This particular engagement focuses on ideas of social sustainability and resilience, and it considers those in relation to a fishing community in North Norfolk around Wells, next to the sea, which is a beautiful part of the UK if you don't know it. So these concepts, social sustainability and resilience, and they're not only fundamental for UK fisheries and struggling fishing communities, but they're also strategic policy areas in UK national policy making. Social sustainability concerns the processes and the institutions that enable current and future generations of fishers to live well together in livable communities. And it considers formal and informal processes. And the idea of resilience is about bouncing back or bouncing back better after crises. So it can be used in quite sort of neoliberal or progressive ways. So it's quite an open policy discourse. But a key idea is that resilient fishing communities are not only more socially sustainable, but they're also better able to withstand the many environmental and social challenges that fishing communities face. Our research and our engagement told us that fishing communities around the UK already actually possess many of the skills and networks and resources and capabilities that they need to help them flourish. However, they're also facing mounting pressures from many directions, including the impacts of climate change, the coastal squeeze or the spatial squeeze from urban development, inflation. Obviously, it costs a lot to run a fishing boat, and regulation that simply isn't fit for purpose. So despite the vulnerability of inshore fisheries in the UK, fishing either directly or indirectly sustains and contributes to the socio-economic welfare of many coastal regions and supports livelihoods well beyond the fisheries catching sector. So in our arts-based engagement, we wanted to conduct a workshop that involved reflection and directed discussion around a small group of fisheries and coastal stakeholders using our creative artifact, Sonic Postcard. So George is going to talk about the processes of making these Sonic postcards and some of the conceptual thinking behind them. And I'll discuss how we've used our postcard Fishing for Life in policy engagement and in a workshop, and talk about some of the lessons that we have learned and are still learning about creative policy engagements. And then George will finish with some reflections on arts-based research and practice. So over to you, George.
Thanks. Okay then. So the Sonic Postcard Fishing for Life it's a 14-minute sound work which was co-created with stakeholders, fishers, researchers, and a sound artist for a AHRC art engagement project called Sounding Out Wells. Now, that was a follow-on project from a project called Sounding Coastal Change, which focused on environmental and social change in North Norfolk on the coast, and was one of two kind of spin-off projects. And this spin-off project produced a set of 8 Sonic postcards for Wells Maltings and Heritage Centre. Part of the initial funding application really was because Wells had an archive, an oral history archive. In the end, that didn't get used as much as we might have hoped. It didn't prove to be as rich a source as we'd hoped it would. But at least a couple of the postcards got based on that material. The kind of strapline for all the work that we've done there, Sounding Coastal Change, Sounding Out Wells, and Making Sand Dunes Public, which was a third of the projects, is that we use sound, voice, music, and different kinds of listening to explore the ways in which the North Norfolk coast is changing and how people's lives are changing with it. So that's the kind of public-facing rationale for this. So as Lisa's been saying, Fishing for Life explores the social, economic and environmental challenges facing fishing communities in Wells and the strategies that fishers use to cope with them. So we were aiming to set out some of these challenges in such a way as it would encourage listeners to this sound work in Wells Maltings and indeed elsewhere to become more familiar with those issues and think about the kind of possibilities and alternatives that we might face in the future. So it's kind of based on a set of interviews with fishers themselves, processing companies, industry officials, representatives, and it illustrates how they work collaboratively to create networks to support their social sustainability and resilience, as Lisa's just been saying. and about how they adapt and are thinking of adapting and trying to adapt to current and future changes and challenges. There's a kind of history to this postcard making. The word sonic postcards were kind of invented when we needed to display a set of postcards that had been made almost as a gift by sound artist Sam Richards and Lona Kozic for Sounding Coastal Change. They came in to do some work with us, and they spent some time with us. And while they were there, they just made these things, and they were very, very interesting, quite wonderful, I believe. One of them was called the Shingle Bank, and it was about a particular nature-based coastal management solution at a place called Blakeney, between Blakeney and Clyde, on a very particularly beautiful part of the Norfolk coast. And what the story was is that there was a shingle bank along the beach, and the sea kept coming in and overtopping the bank and coming in and flooding the village. And then the coastal managers said, we're not going to rebuild the shingle bank as we did before, we're just going to let it be natural. And everybody was up in arms about it. They were worried about their property, their homes, their fields, etc. But over a period of years, they found that what it actually did was it reduced the force of the water by making the slope of the bank more shallow. And when the water did overtop, it flowed back more quickly, so it didn't stay like a huge great pond of water in people's homes. So it had a whole series of positive effects, and in actual fact, flooding was less prevalent rather than more prevalent as people had feared. So this postcard told this story through interviews and oral testimony, but also through sound and music to make a kind of creative art documentary, which was almost like a piece of music to listen to. And it got me thinking that we might be able to use this format because these were incredibly popular with local people. They were shown in Wells Maltings, and then they wanted to show them at the Norfolk Wildlife Trust, and they wanted to show them at this place and that place. And so they had a lot of exposure. I think, well, this format of this short sound work, creative sound work, must be something that attracts people's attention. Maybe we can get people's attention by doing this and address issues such as the shingle bank, which are challenges for the coast in the future. So we've been experimenting with a whole range of creative engagements, and we had a long-term collaboration with the Norfolk Coast Partnership, multi-agency organisations that produced the 5-year plan for the Norfolk coast. And they strongly encouraged us to do this kind of thing with a view to helping them produce their next 5-year plan. So what we wanted to do with this and other works was encourage people, publics, local people and others to think beyond their everyday routine experiences and recognise the interdependence with sometimes unseen and unheard environmental systems, processes and ways of life, and then find creative ways of imagining and working through alternatives and possibilities for the future, not necessarily based on taken for granted assumptions like build a big shingle bank and we'll all be protected, so that it might help people think more constructively and positively about the issues they face, for instance, with climate change, increased storminess, higher sea levels, etc., etc. Okay, next slide. So there are a whole variety of, just very briefly fill you on some of the ideas that lie behind our thinking, so to the conceptualization of this. So we wanted to use these creative works to presence in some form or another voices, processes, experiences or entities that might otherwise be invisible, unheard, ignored or unnoticed. And that's the kind of creative strategy we might think of as giving voice. And a lot of environmental artworks are about giving voice in one way or another, either to flora, fauna, environmental processes, etc., to increase sensitivity to what's going on. We wanted to use them to dramatise environmental and social issues as an invitation for participants to rework and rethink them, re-narrativise them, or take debate forward, the debate themselves, and ultimately make up their own minds about the questions we'd sort of post for them. So they kind of wanted to be, they want to set out the issues, but be kind of open-ended. So not give them the conclusion, but say, here you are, now go away and think about it, make up your own mind. It's like kind of teaching strategy. We wanted to use the sonic postcards to articulate alternatives, and that kind of draws on the well-rehearsed idea in the arts, we're all familiar with this, that the arts can enable us to expand and develop imaginative responses in such a way that we might be able to articulate and think thoughts and express and share ideas that were previously either poorly formed or difficult to articulate and communicate. And lastly, and most importantly, as part of a broader strategy of creating deliberative processes to engage people in thinking constructively about the future, we wanted to use these artworks to help create conversational spaces, which might include semi-structured or curated workshops to allow and enable participants to shape issues and matters of concern in ways that speak to them and their own lives. And that kind of idea draws almost directly on the kind of workings of somebody like John Dewey on art, or indeed in kind of social process art, somebody like Grant Kester. So, as you're probably aware, there's been a long-running debate in the world of socially engaged art between those who argue that making a work co-collaboratively is just a means to an end, and that the conversation, discussion and learning which results from the making is the most important. And that's Grant Kester's position, well-known, well established. And there are also those who argue that the aesthetic value of finished artwork remains important, and that there remains a vital role for the skill, imagination and voice of the artist as a responsible and responsive creator. And that kind of perspective is often associated with the critique made by Claire Bishop and in the book Artificial Hells and elsewhere. But we don't see those as mutually exclusive. And in our work, we sometimes want to co-produce works with groups, but then use these works in workshops as to stimulate conversation and discussion, or we might get artists to produce work which is used then to stimulate people to do something and probably produce their own artwork. So we're not making a distinction between the artwork and the social process. We're kind of trying to find ways of bringing those together and using each where it seems to be appropriate and useful. What is really important is that the kind of public engagements that are wrapped around these things need to form part of clearly articulated deliberative strategies. And you may say something about that later, Lisa. Sure. We draw conceptually on the idea of the open work put forward by Launce Wise in his paper in the journal Organised Sound, but most importantly, we draw on Bruno Latour's idea of the spokesperson as a someone or a something that translates and articulates interests, actions, and the roles of actors to others. It communicates a position as a kind of heterogeneous position. And with that in mind, our postcards were guided by a kind of imperative to foreground a range of practical and locally based knowledges and place these along scientific and formal knowledges and understandings, presence the voicing of human and non-human voices in a manner which is appropriate to each, have works which had a shape and form which express the materials and issues from which they're drawn, most importantly, show evidence of their making, which demonstrates the limits to any particular form of knowledge, particularly formal scientific knowledge, and can be used as part of a social process of publicly deliberating issues of coastal change. So not all sonic postcards fulfill these equally or fully. Where Fishing for Life's concerned, the one we want to play today, We hope it does foreground a range of locally based knowledges and to a certain extent place these alongside more formal understandings, less so than might otherwise be. It has a kind of form which takes us on a fishing trip, and this is helped by readings from an autobiographical book by about Wells fishers, written and read for our postcard by the local harbour master, who was a former fisher before he became harbour master. It does show evidence of his making in the ambiences of each interview, so in the pub, over the phone, in an office, on the quayside. So we move from these different sites. And also we have the occasional presence of a questioner asking the questions. The participants were asked to describe themselves and what they did, what challenges they faced, and how these challenges produced responses, what what they'd like to see happen, what were their own solutions, and to kind of leave these hanging in the air for the listener to think, well, yes, we should do that, or yes, they should do the other, or whatever. So at this point, I'd like to play you a few minutes from the postcard, which is 14 minutes long. So I'm going to play a little bit from the middle, a little bit from the beginning, a little bit from the middle, and a couple of minutes at the end. And I'd like to start that now, if that's okay. Thank you.
Fishermen and Wells have answered the call of the sea into records began. The sea is in their blood. Knowledge and skill is passed down through the generations. With many of the same families keeping the fishing tradition alive through the centuries.
And growing up around the fishermen, drinking in the pubs and fishermen, and sort of always playing in the sea and having own boats in the family. And then when it comes to earning money, sort of like summertime, I help by moving crabs and boxes on the quay. And then it just sort of whirlwinded in and I end up putting a life jacket on and going to sea with them.
Basically, we run a fishing boat with my brother. I'm a skipper, and my brother does the shore side. We process, we cook the crab. We got dressers, we process them. They're sold on stall to local restaurants, Fill and Skate, and Norwich markets where we supply.
Have more than 1, 2 or 3 species to be able to fish. Not, nature gives and nature takes away, and we have to be able to do something else.
Everything has a cost. The only way a fisherman can get his cost, get that cost back and recoup it, was overdone. So you have to fish either more game, or you target different species, or you target the same species more, which then there's a conservation implication. Or, and the biggest thing is, you go some days when it isn't fit. You push your luck, you push the limits, you push the boundary of your vessel, but let's get to the stage where you've got to have a second income because fishing won't pay the bills.
And I'm lucky to be able to know as many people as I do while I was living here all my life and being able to say, actually, this isn't for me anymore. I'm going to go and try fishing or farming or something. I've done all sorts, fishing, farming, bar work, building, roofing, oak training, just to name a few. So
it's definitely a job where you learn on the job through watching, listening, doing.
We're always hanging around the boat, don't have a trip, and then come for a food trip to the fisherman, and you can come on a weekend, boy. And then you learn on the trade, and then next thing you know, they got their own boat and their own fishing, and away they go.
Unknown, be on your own and feel free. Whereas when you've got a tracking device on you, it almost makes you feel like you're being watched, like you're doing something illegally, like you're a criminal, which is really difficult. Fishermen are a dying breed, let's say. I mean, I think what was the latest survey was 11,000 fishermen nationwide. And I think as long as fishermen stick together, you stand a fighting chance.
What would help your industry then?
Yeah, being heard. Being heard.
I mean, we have probably one of the, or could be, one of the major fish food producing areas in the country. For a promotional campaign to sell local fish.
All fish along this east coast. One is to financially help them sell from the boat.
So would it help people fishing in North Norfolk to be able to fish more flexibly,
Yes.
different species, different gear?
We should go and speak to the head teachers, find out if there's anyone that has shown an interest, fund that young person to go and do their sea survival course at 16. At least then they've got it, and at the weekends they could spend time on a commercial boat, understanding if they like.
You know, you go to sea with the 10 empty boxes, a bag full of food, and you come back hopefully with the boxes full, your bag's empty, or perhaps not if you've been busy, and you know you've seen things and done things that nobody else can even comprehend, and that's what keeps our guys going.
Over to you, Lisa.
Thanks so much, George. So as you heard when you listened to excerpts from the postcards, the postcards through their polyvocality, they don't tell or instruct. Instead, they're intended to raise awareness, to enhance sensitivity, to increase attentiveness to issues that may be misrecognized or are less heard. So a primary aim for us then was to use the postcards to stimulate better informed discussion around some of these issues, around some of these challenges and coping strategies, in order to generate some more productive dialogue and learning in a sector that's notoriously divided and riven with mistrust. So we got some funding to take this postcard forward in a policy engagement, and the engagement was designed to help foster better relationships and to think about fisheries decision making and bring to the table, if you like, some of the sort of less heard issues that are facing the sector. So we ran a workshop discussing the benefits and the barriers to arts-based engagement, focusing particularly in fisheries policy making. So we invited policymakers, engagement officers, NGOs. We had representatives from the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, the fisheries governing body, the Marine Management Organisation, the UK's Fisheries Science Body, the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science, and the fishing sector NGO Fishing into the Future. So these were national policy and stakeholder and NGO organisations. So we invited the participants to listen to the entire postcard. We hadn't sent it to them in advance. We wanted to listen to it together. And then to first reflect individually and then together on a series of discussion questions that were prompted by the audio. So we started with quite a specific question asking about how the sonic postcard might encourage participants to think through potential scenarios and solutions. And then we sort of stood back and asked some questions intended to provoke kind of wider reflection on creative engagement for policymaking. And those are the questions there on the slide. So how and to what extent might arts-based approaches help policymakers engage with stakeholders in fisheries? How and to what extent might arts-based methods help policymakers to identify and collect different forms of evidence? And the kind of the notion and the discourse of evidence is what they're working with in policymaking. So we had to kind of stretch the idea of evidence to kind of fit with our creative practices. And we also asked, was there a role for arts-based methods and engagements in policy and evaluation, in trying to gather information and reflect on the success or failure of different initiatives? And this is at a time when fisheries policy making is going through an enormous amount of change. So just some reflections from that workshop. The science body CFAS said that they'd been inspired to explore some of the ideas further and integrate them with a project they'd initiated, exploring best practice, and integrating qualitative and quantitative evidence. Another stakeholder engagement officer from MMO said that it was an opportunity for learning and sharing together. And one DEFRA official thought that the arts-based approaches could well play a key role in their engagement work. So are we on the right slide now? Yep. So what did we learn? So we took the reflections and evaluations from the workshop, and we tried to kind of group them and think about the sort of the general learning from this kind of engagement. We thought that these kinds of creative artifacts, as we call them, could help to communicate both to stakeholders and from stakeholders to policymakers, and kind of bridge that conduit in a very divided sector. It could be about increasing awareness of some of the fisheries issues that are not often understood or are cliched and actually are quite complicated and changing fast. We thought that the discussion sort of reflected that these kinds of artifacts could help to activate and engage publics through both listening and participating. And potentially it could enable stakeholders to feel more empowered, but we'd need to do further research on that. And obviously that's a difficult idea. We thought that the kind of interactions between the stakeholders and listening felt quite meaningful, and it really sort of seemed to facilitate some quite genuine dialogue. We thought that these artifacts could be used to recognize a diversity in forms of knowledge, including feelings, values, experiences, and therefore this kind of process could be potentially more inclusive than traditional stakeholder engagements. We use sound, but you might use, different arts-based policy engagements to capture and express multiple forms of expression beyond, simple language. Many stakeholder engagements are about filling in an evaluation form, which can be, really alienating for some fisheries stakeholders that we talk to. And generating discussions around these artifacts could be used to generate a kind of collective sense-making that might be missing in traditional forms of stakeholder participation. So we felt that these kinds of workshops could be used to think more imaginatively and more creatively, and as George said earlier, beyond sort of mainstream solutions to environmental and coastal challenges. But obviously, there are challenges to these kinds of processes and engagements. One policymaker talked about the need to produce stakeholder feedback that was considered legitimate. Would a postcard be a legitimate form of evaluation for policymakers? And how could policymakers ensure that these processes could be replicated? I mean, part of their value is that they are different and contextually specific, but in stakeholder engagements, across the UK, you might need some way of kind of replicating the process. Obviously, these methods, as you all well know, take a huge amount of time and effort and can be costly. So some thought needs to be given to those sort of more practical and equally important challenges. But overall, I think it was felt that these kinds of creative engagements could well encourage conversations around challenging, very difficult to articulate and quite complex issues that are what we might call wicked problems. Over to you, George.
Thank you very much. Just very, very briefly, some kind of reflections on sort of where we are and what we think and what this kind of enabled us to think. So I think we want to emphasize that we don't, we want to move away from the idea that creativity is the preserve of artists, but rather it's a kind of standpoint, a way of knowing and being and engaging that is playful, communicative, and intrinsically open. And we argue that this is what's needed. Lisa's talked about wicked problems. Think about the issues of the Anthropocene, the complex environmental and social issues that we face that require new ways of thinking and engaging people in order to address them. And we believe that creative methods, creative practices one way or another can play an important part in that. So that's one important issue for us. Following the socially engaged art historian, Grant Kester, we think that one of the most important things is what he calls this holding a space, creating an openness for greater dialogue, reflection, and learning. And in this, there is an important lineage back to the work of John Dewey, his work on education and on art and on notions of democracy, and bringing those three things together. We, in terms of planning, which is where we've dealt with this, we think that these decisions should be a matter of learning and a learning process. And key to that is the final bullet point on the slide, really, that creative engagement must be mutually transformative, not a matter of data harvesting from policymakers or scientists, but something which, when participants take part in something and they speak to the centre, as it were, there is evidence that what they're saying is being recognised and that it does change something. And only in those ways will trust be rebuilt, because that's the important thing, between policymakers, politicians, managers, scientists, etc., and all the publics that we know, particularly on the coast, who are increasingly sceptical of those in authority, as we know through the current political situation. And I think that's probably where we should stop, because we've more than gone over our time. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you. I'm going to give you a virtual round of applause to both of you for the presentation. So thank you very much for that to begin with. Could I ask you to stop sharing your screen so that we can see the two of you a little bit better now, as we are entering into that space where we're having a conversation? There are a number of people who have put some comments in the chat box. I'm hoping that some of these people will come into the conversation as well. But there were comments like, for example, the postcards fitting very well within the concept of digital storytelling. And then somebody else saying, I'm imagining sitting on the quayside, picking up a receiver, listening to these recorded interviews. So that kind of, sort of public space where there's like public art installation almost as well. Somebody else said a quote from Lisa's part of the presentation where you said those sonic postcards don't tell or instruct, but they raise sensitivity, and that's something that's really interesting. I'd like to pick up on that a little bit here before we kind of move on to the final comment that's on the chat box still. And please, anybody and everybody else, do come into that conversation as well. I'm just always kicking it off because that's my prerogative as the person who hosts and organizes these things. So I always take the chance to talk to the people myself first before I allow other people to take the word. So what I'm interested in is what you both have been saying is, very, very true for any kind of arts-based approach. Whether it's the sonic postcard or a painting or an installation or a sculpture, whatever it is. So the medium, it doesn't perhaps matter quite as much because all of those things have this element of evocation, illumination, and expression that we're drawing on when we're using those arts-based approaches. But I was wondering, have you reflected on specifically the sonic postcard and the sound and the value of that as separate from other arts-based approaches? You know, what does the sound bring to this? And is it that we only, under quotation marks, that we only need to hear people's voices, or is it that we, you know, have to hear the background noises as well, like the sea and the sound of the fishing boats and the horns, you know, all of those things? So could you talk to that a little bit, perhaps?
Yes, there's lots of questions in there and lots of interesting questions. First of all, we'll come to the specifics of reflecting on sound. The first project was initially called Listening to Climate Change, and the idea of using, so because I work on music and landscape was one of the places I came from, sort of cultural histories of music and landscape and politics, funnily enough. But the idea of using sound is that a variety of things. So firstly, you can get a really good idea of physical processes, trajectories, through the kind of crescendos, diminuendos, climaxes, etc., which in sound. And it's a really good way of expressing data. So data sonification is something which we haven't explored in this postcard, but which we're really interested in. We're really interested in sound because it brings things together in a different temporality, and it can bring distant things close and make close things distant. It's immersive. Sound worlds are immersive, so you're kind of enclosed and involved with sound in ways which can be achieved in a gallery space or in a theatrical space, but is actually a much greater effort to do so. You know, if I put my headphones sitting on my desk, I can be deep in a piece of music or somewhere else in the world or whatever, and experiencing things. So that way in which sound is effective and touches us so deeply is really important. In addition to the fact that it can show these dynamics and changes beyond kind of everyday human understanding, you know, long-term change over 10,000 years or whatever it is, or sudden changes, and indeed can bring data to life. The notion of voice, of course, isn't dependent on humans. So, you know, birds, animals have voices. We work with a kind of metaphorical notion of voice, which we take from Latour, etc., and realize how problematic the idea of voice, as it is so often assumed in political theory, how, you know, the rational human voice is the most important thing. And not all humans necessarily even get classified as having rational human voices, you know. So, but that definition of a simple definition of voice can prejudice not only things which are not human, but certain humans too. So thinking through sound helps us to overcome some of these issues and to animate worlds and processes and ecologies and environments and ways of life in ways which would be difficult to do otherwise.
Thank you very much. So there's a comment there from one of the people here who says, this makes me think of the lady that goes to the underground every day to listen to the recording of her husband saying the station names, which was recorded 50 years ago, because it gives her comfort to hear this voice. So that was one of the things that was mentioned in this context. So there was one question here. I think that's probably for Lisa. How do you sell the value of creative and storytelling to policymakers, especially for smaller research projects?
It can be challenging. I think because these creative engagements offer something very different to traditional forms of engagement, so something richer, more inclusive, more diverse. And as I say, that sensitivity to the complexity and to the polyvocality is key in a sector like fisheries. So I think it's important to start with the issue you're trying to explore with the specific policy sector. So what are the issues at stake? And then think about how creative engagements, creativity, social process arts can presence those issues. So rather than saying, the arts works, what the arts work better, but start from so that's what I would say. I mean, the policymakers that we talked to, well, they came along because they were really interested. So it was quite a self-selecting bunch of people. If we had to do it to a much wider policymaking audience, I can imagine some raised eyebrows. And this kind of thing takes time, and
when you say that, to be honest, I think at the moment there is quite a push towards participatory and arts-based approaches, because there is the recognition that, as academics, we shouldn't just be writing for our own selves and to, foster our own careers. So I think there is that kind of more openness to it as well. Vic, can I just say, Vicky has got a question that will also kind of come into that as well. Vicky, do you want to come in?
Yeah, sure. So my question was about accessibility. So you've got a lovely kind of audio artifact there that's got the intonations of voice, it's got the background sounds and everything. And obviously this is a really compelling artifact that engages people. How do you involve everybody from the accessibility point of view? And how do you do that in a way that's really engaging rather than just, here's a boring transcript?
Well, it's a real issue, and it's one we haven't solved, and it's one that we still ongoing at Wells Maltings as to what we do to be able to involve everybody. Now, okay, then, one thing is these things are available online as well as in the gallery. So anybody can listen to them anywhere in the world, but that doesn't get over the issue of people being hard of hearing, for instance. It really doesn't get over that. And the qualities of sound are such that, as we just described, it's like something being tactile. You can't have tactility without touch, can you? I don't know, maybe you can. So it's an ongoing problem, and I work at the OU, so everything we make has to be available to everybody.
Yeah.
And that's exceedingly difficult and exceedingly constraining, so there become certain things you can't do. I think it would also depend if one was going to use these, as we do, in particular circumstances, in workshop situations, etc., others, we would have to look at that on an individual basis and the participants who are going to be there and fit it around them. I think starting from where they are is going to have to be one of the important considerations. Sorry.
It is a tough one, and I think having something like the photographs of the people talking would really help, with photographs of the landscape, and that would just kind of anchor you in the space. I think that would be nice.
Just to say that on Wells Maltings, that's exactly what we do have. We have like a kind of slideshow which follows this through, so that we do have that precise.
Lovely.
And actually it's really nice. But it changes for somebody who's sighted, it changes the experience.
Yes. Because
then one is reading the sounds against the images, and the images always take first place. So it changes it in ways which disadvantage the sound for the sighted listener.
It's a wonderful project, though. Thanks.
So can I just say, as in the chat, there is something for you to follow up, the two of you. In terms of hearing impairments, the Oral Diversity Network is doing good work in this area. So that may be something for you to kind of be aware of. As somebody who's hard of hearing and wearing hearing aids myself, this is quite something that's close to my heart as well. And I find that, like making things available so that I can stream it directly into my hearing aids, that is something that's really, really helpful. And often in museums and galleries, they don't do that. They have, these receivers, have to listen through the receiver. And that is really difficult because then it distorts the sound for me. Whereas if I can just scan a QR code and it gets that directly, from the phone into my hearing aids, I've got a much better experience. So there are tricks that you can play with.
There also exist as a set of postcards, actual physical postcards.
Yes.
Image on and a QR code.
Yes. I like that idea. I like that. So there is one person who said to me they have got a question, and that's Juliana.
Yeah.
Can I bring you in, please?
Hello, thank you. I mean, it's a fascinating project. I love it. And I was just thinking about the title in terms of postcards, so I'm just thinking, have you thought that this can be a traveling thing, so you can take this to other coastlines, so because the idea of postcard and travel, it comes together. And I saw that, because you are creating this reflective space, what happens if you take it to the other coastline? What are the experience of others, So you can, sometimes you cannot take the coast, but you have this artifact that you can be moving in different geographical areas. And even in land, what happens if you put it in, so what other people that they are far away from the coastline, what do they think about this, So this was my common question, if you have thought about it, this, because of the idea of the postcard and traveling, it makes me think about it.
Interesting that's exactly along the lines we're working at the moment in getting coastal communities to make postcards for other coastal communities and send them back. So you have a reciprocity between places, which stimulates discussion around particular issues.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
And that discussion itself can form the basis of further creative work.
And I think
So you have this kind of, sorry, Lisa.
one of the things we want to challenge is that everything has to be negotiated by sort of centralized policy making, and you can have learning across spaces, sort of peer to peer. And so we wanted to think about how we could extend this project beyond North Norfolk and have some kind of learning platforms that use these creative artifacts, and to explore what's at stake when something travels, something that's so context specific. What does it do, and what do you learn, and what can you take from it? So those are excellent points, and something close to our hearts.
So can I just say there were, sorry, George.
No, fine.
Sorry, there are two more questions for you too. I'm quite aware of the time, so I want to make sure that we get all the questions asked. So I've got one question here, which is: do you think sonic postcards might be more suitable for particular groups of participants? I'm thinking the possibility of applying it in researching students or even teachers, for example. What do you think about that?
It could work. I mean, you just got to know your group. I mean, these things are very definitely context, situation, site specific, and what works well in one place with one group of people may very easily not work elsewhere. Being sensitive to the people you're working with and doing something which is sort of on their terms is really, really important. And in this case, it was sonic postcards, but somewhere else it might absolutely be something different. On the other hand, this idea could be taken somewhere else and used with great effectiveness. We don't know.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Pamela, you've got your hand up. Can I bring you in, please?
Thank you. I put it in the chat, but essentially, just first of all, congratulations. It's wonderful. The last time I heard of sonic postcards, it was with Trevor Wishart.
Yeah.
The 80s, where he got school children to send to young people equivalent age that were imprisoned. And that was their contact, to send sonic postcards, an audio file and some text to sort of, what is the sound of your environment? What does that feel like? Just the idea of sound as felt, not necessarily heard, is something we get when we go for walks in the woods and in forests and we swim. There's a sound that is felt. And so sensing bodies, is there something to be done that looks at the sort of sensitivity of sensing bodies beyond hearing the sound, but sensing and feeling the sound, which is something that children do beautifully. And then, it's sort of schooled out of them. But that feeling, the feeling of sound, the vibration of it, which is so inclusive. And of course, it brings into the whole thing, I'm getting a question here, affect and materiality. So have you analysed the materiality of this sound, of these sounds, or is there something in the analysis of the materials that matter that might be looked at?
You're absolutely right. And of course, so several things. Number one, Richard's work was the most fantastic precursor to what we call connective aesthetics you could possibly imagine. I mean, that's absolutely fantastic, isn't it? Second thing, one thing that did strike me, and what I was going to say earlier, very, very quickly, we got children in a school, it's well, set of 3 schools, to interview their parents and grandparents about change and the change in their village and on the coast. And what came back was not the parents talking to us, but the parents talking to their children and grandchildren in that wonderfully personal and intimate way. And it was the most wonderful and privileged insight into somebody's world and lives and social relationships you could possibly imagine. So that sense of the thing traveling and people talking to each other, and then that gathering layers, etc., as it goes along, is really, really important, and something that we're trying to work with, and we've experimented with, and there's a lot more to go, like kind of message in a bottle sort of idea.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's something which is very important. Now, there are sound artists who work with this kind of intimacy of embodied movement. I can't remember the guy's name, but there's 2 or 3 I could tell you about, who closely mic themselves with stereo microphones and walk through gardens and over gravel and down entries and paths into tunnels and things. And you get that absolutely visceral sense of their movement. And that's a recognized form of sound art.
Yes.
Lastly, where the sound, it's really important to us that the environmental sounds, the sound of shingle in the postcard about sand dunes, the waves moving the body of material around, and the kind of way that rumbles in the pit of your stomach is really, really important to that, as indeed are the sounds of the boats and the engines and the people moving in the one that we've got here. One of the problems we experienced is we worked with a sound artist at one stage who his work was on dementia, and his approach to sound art was one of absolute verbal clarity, and he wanted to strip everything out and leave only the voice, because that was what was really important to him and his constituency. So it's been an interesting
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, everybody. This was a really, really exciting hour. I knew it was going to be, which is why I got Lisa basically contacted Lisa and asked her to spend the time with us. So thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you very much, George. I really, really appreciate that. Just for the sake of completeness, as always, I am sharing my final slide with some details of the YouTube channel, the Buzzsprout channel, the Practice as Research website. So please do connect with us, and keep an eye on the website and the details, because we will have another one of these sessions sometime soon. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Thanks so much, Nicole.